Hello, welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni, and if this is your first time listening, this is a podcast dedicated to fantasy writing and trying to become just a little bit better at it. In this podcast, I take a look, sight unseen, at a prompt from the fantasy writing subreddit on Reddit. And it's r/fantasy writers to be more specific. And this prompt comes to us curated by one of our producers, Natalia Emmons, who found this for me. I have not seen this yet, so I'm going to be reacting to this prompt in real time. And so hopefully you enjoy this, and we'll, of course, take a look at what some other folks, too, have to say in the comment section so we can get as well-rounded advice as we can. So let's take a look at this. And if you don't know who I am a published fantasy author, but you can listen to the first episode for a little bit more background on my bona fides and all that good stuff. All right. This comes to us from user Nick's Spoon, and their headline is, "Too many ideas, not enough stories." Okay. As I expect many writers do, I have a notebook filled with ideas, potentially fun or interesting elements that might be worth including in a story, whether it be a character quirk, a weird setting element, or even just a short sentence that evokes a particular emotion or vibe. The problem is, none of these have resulted in anything approaching an actual story. I have written a number of things that were seeded by these ideas, but in retrospect, they could hardly be considered stories. They're mostly a bunch of poorly defined characters wandering around, not doing much, who encounter whatever idea sparked the desire to write, but never wind up participating in an actual plot, which you might guess is rather distressing. That after years of writing on my own, going into crippling debt to get an MFA, reading, and about writing, I'll be more specific. So they're saying going into crippling debt to get an MFA, reading, just general reading about writing, and thinking about writing, listening to Lord knows how many podcasts about writing. Hello. I still can't get from idea to story, which is in a word sad. When I look at the books that I love to read from the POV of someone who wants to write, not just as someone enjoying the story, I sometimes can't even begin to fathom how the author got from the beginning of the story to the end, and I suffered through multiple literary analysis classes. I feel like I've learned a lot about the nitty-gritty of writing, about character and setting and plot, and the many nuts and bolts that go into the creation of all these elements. In practice, though, they all seem to wind up missing in action or flatter than the metaphorical paper they're written on. So to cut to the chase in an already overlong and rambling post, that feels familiar, how do you lot go from idea to story? Both pantsing and outlining have somehow resulted in nearly the same results for me, so perhaps I'm going about the outlining process in the wrong way as well. Do you have any concrete examples of outlines others have written, or a more prescriptive method for outlining? If you are a pantser, how do you make sure that you actually have a story, and not just a load of cardboard cutouts flopping around, waiting for your, quote, one cool thing to come along? Preferably before you write 20,000 words and then come to that realization. Sorry if this is overly convoluted and confusing. You can probably see the recurring issues I run into just from this post. All insights are greatly appreciated. I love the self-awareness, and yes, it is a bit of a long prompt, but it's good because you're giving me a lot of information. It's going to really help me react to this, hopefully in a very constructive way. In fact, reading this, I feel so tempted, right, to not just share this podcast with you, original poster, but also to write some of my thoughts down, because what you're talking about here is, I know exactly what you're going through. And first of all, it is extremely normal. I have seen this so many times. I have seen this come up again and again. It's happened to me as well. And that is, have you ever heard of being overprepared for a test? So the problem that's happening here is that you are so in the weeds of learning all the nitty-gritty, and that is great. You need that information. There is a lot that you probably know that I'll probably say, and you're like, well, I know that, right? If you've listened to a bunch of podcasts, I can probably guess a few of them. You know how everything kind of comes together. You know what these things mean, but what you seem to be struggling with is, how do I just actually write the dang thing and I come up with a story that works? And you mentioned the outlining process. And this is something that I learned after, 3 novels. It took me a bit to get to this. 4 novels, actually, now that I think about it, in 5 books total. I finally learned how to actually outline. And I mentioned this in the last episode. I mentioned how an outline is not just a chapter by chapter, this is what happens. This is what I was running into. And this, There are a lot of YouTube videos, unfortunately. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about outlining in a very spreadsheet kind of way. And that is not helpful. So Nick's Spoon, user, original poster, whatever I'm going to call you, really what you're dealing with here is you need to learn how to outline in a way that develops the book, not in a way that outlines a bunch of ideas that you're coming up with in the moment. Because here's what ends up happening, right? You do all this research, you have an idea, and I'm assuming by idea you mean premise, some kind of hook or some kind of like, what if the world was like this? What if there was a secret school for, psychics, whatever it is. And you're like, okay, that's the idea. How do I do the story? Right? And you're like, I have all these characters, they're flopping around. And then what I think you're probably doing is you're either pantsing. And when they say pantsing, what they mean is that they are discovery writing. So they are sitting down and they're just kind of letting the words come to them and they're not really planning ahead. So they're like, maybe I'm in this kind of scene, and they just start writing it. And there's not really any planning. I do not like this type of writing generally, but on its own. Okay, discovery writing is good, but it only really, in my opinion, works for most people if you are discovery writing with some kind of blueprint in mind. And that's what I'm going to get into next. And then, but for sake of example, when they are outlining, my guess is that their outline looks something a little bit like, here's what happens in chapter 1. Here are a few sentences on chapter 2. They need to get to this place, and then this happens. That is, honestly, if you do that at all, which it's okay to do that kind of thing, that's like maybe step 12 in the outlining process. Because what's happening is you are skipping way ahead. And there is a whole development process that is going to serve you so much better. And a lot of this I learned, not just a lot of this, the vast majority of this I learned from the wonderful Kate Browning. Kate Browning is my mentor for the last several years. I've developed 2 books using her method, and they are light years ahead of the work that I did beforehand. And Kate does this thing called the Breakthrough Writers Bootcamp. Strongly recommended. I'm not paid to recommend it. I just really love it. And I've literally already reached out to Kate about hopefully having her on sometime, because she is just so insightful and her work is extraordinarily great. But she is also an author, and she also happens to be a book development editor. And one of the things I learned from her is that in the outlining process, you really need to start with a bunch of very specific questions. Just take it all the way back to the beginning. And this is something that I've done with other friends who've come to me asking for help, or other folks that have asked me, hey, how do you go about writing a book? Where do you start? You start with a few things. Just the basics. What's the genre? Well, you're listening to fantasy writing for barbarians, so I'm going to assume fantasy, right? But then be a little more specific. What kind of fantasy is this? Urban fantasy, dark academia? Be a little bit more specific, and just keep in mind, you can change all this later. Just give some general impressions of what kind of genre do you think you're going to be catering to? Then ask yourself, okay, what's the age demographic, right? 18 to 30, 30 to 40, maybe it's middle grade, maybe it's young adult. Try to hone in on the age range that you actually want for this novel. There are a few more things you can get into and write all this stuff down, but how many point of view characters do you want to have? And again, it can change. You don't have to commit. What would be a working title? Something to just kind of throw a title out there. It doesn't have to be the real thing quite yet. And then start asking yourself, why do you want to write this book, right? What do you think people will like about this book? And then once you do that, once you have a lot of that stuff written down, just so you have it, you're going to start getting your mind a little bit prepared for really what I think is the most crucial step. And that's not a specific outline, but write a pitch. 1 paragraph. Write it like you're writing it to an agent. It can resemble a query. It can resemble the back jacket of a fantasy novel that you really like. But try to write a pitch. When you dumb things down, you simplify it to its fundamentals. What do you think this pitch should be? And you'll probably write this several times. I'll write one and I'll be like, it could be better. And then I'll write it 5 more times. And I'm like, hey, that's actually getting a little bit better. I'm actually finding the story a little bit more engaging than I assumed I would. And then by the time you get to maybe the 5th, 6th, 7th, whatever it is, you're going to start noticing that you're coming up with more ideas. And you're coming up with the plot. You're coming up with the characters. Because here's the thing. if you try to do this stuff without writing it down and doing an exercise, it's just going to slip out of your mind. And you're not going to really find yourself really just sticking with a single element. When you actually write it out and you have your mind in the querying process, the pitching process, you're going to come up with, well, that doesn't really make sense. Why would the character do that? Oh, maybe they're going to do that because they have this power, and that would actually work for. This is the way to start. I genuinely, I've talked about this before, but when you start, you can start with all kinds of things like a lore letter, for example. Maybe you're writing a letter about the world that the main character. You can do stuff like that for sure, and you can draft a little bit, but this should all be in parallel with the pitch. And if you're doing your job correctly, this pitch should be more or less intact by the time you finish outlining. And it may be totally different by the time you finish writing the actual book, the first draft, whatever it is, maybe third, fourth, fifth revision. But by the time you're done with the outlining process, that pitch should really be intact. And you can go back and you can mess with it. You can come up with other ideas. It's not set in stone. But by doing this, you are going to find yourself coming up with what I think you're struggling to come up with, which is the actual story. What is this thing really about? Because the pitch should contain a bunch of different things. And I'm sorry, I'm going on and on about this, but this is a long process and there's so much more I could say about it. But that's why I'm kind of like, go into this zone, poster. Go into this zone of thinking through these things. But your pitch should have several things. And if you read enough Backjacket copies, you read enough successful queries, and I'm assuming that you, as you say, you've read a lot of things about writing and you have watched a lot of videos, watch some of the other videos about querying, right? Before you even write the book, and then try to write a really good pitch. It should have a lot of different elements. It should have a relatable main character, something about them that's kind of plausible, that kind of grounds them and brings them to life. You should have a gut emotional appeal, something that you think is going to really resonate with people after they're done with the book. It needs to have conflict, right? If this happens, then this is going to happen. And you can't have everything. If you get the thing you want, then something else that you want, you don't get. Conflict, right? You need to have an immersive setting. You need to have a setting that is sensory, that has texture to it, that stands out. You need to have some originality, something about this story that you haven't really seen before, right? A little bit of the familiar, but also a lot of the different. And so on and so on. So this is where you should be going with that pitch. And then once you have that pitch, there's a lot more you can do. And I've already gone on long enough, but from there, I think you're gonna have to start doing maybe a little bit of drafting, but also start investigating your main character. What's the major dramatic question of the book? Look up some of that material on YouTube if you're not familiar with it, but there should be a major dramatic question. There should be a major abstract question. The dramatic question should be along the lines of, will Harry Potter defeat Voldemort? Right? That's the major dramatic question. But the major abstract question of Harry Potter, the whole series, is Harry going to find community and belonging? Is he going to find people who care about him for him? Right? Is he going to get over the trauma of, being an outcast in every society and not really fitting in? Right? That's more of the dramatic question, the abstract question. And if you're outlining your story correctly, what you will hopefully end up with is a different answers to both questions. Maybe the character, does defeat Voldemort and they find the sense of belonging. That's a really happy ending. Sometimes books have a little bit more of the grimdark. They're a little bit more like A Song of Ice and Fire in terms of, maybe it's no to both questions. Maybe they don't make it, or they don't win the Game of Thrones. And this character dies before they get a chance to uphold their honor, right? No spoilers, I guess, but sometimes that's why that hits so hard, because you have a character who not only doesn't get what they want dramatically, but they also don't get what they want in the abstract. And that's why the Song of Ice and Fire books are so grim. That's what makes them so dark. So there's so much more to this, but hopefully that's going to spur the beginnings of this sort of thing. And Poster, if you ever get to this, I created a fantasy writing Barbarians username. I might refer you to some very specific things along these lines, because I could talk about this for like over an hour. But yeah, what you're talking about in terms of developing story, you may think that you've read it all and that you with your MFA and everything, That's a great thing to have. And I'm sure you have a ton of information and you know a lot of details, but that tells me that you're ready for the next step, which is really putting some of the more advanced tips to practice. Because a lot of these videos and podcasts and things, they're, while great, for the most part, a lot of them are going to be catered toward beginners, people who are at the very beginning of this sort of journey. And it sounds to me like you're a little bit past that and you're ready to amp up your game. And so that is kind of the spirit of what I'm hopefully trying to communicate there. But all right, I've talked a lot. I might have a little bit more in terms of what I have to say that I could round out as we look at some of the other comments here. So let's take a look at this one from Fruits Paunchy Samurai 1, who says, the thing about story crafting is that you have to actually craft it. There's a lot of intentionality required that just isn't necessary when reading, so it feels overwhelming. My approach is to start with the characters. Where are they starting? Where will they end up? How do you want that journey to go? Consider both physical location and tie it to their emotional and psychological journey as well. And once you have that basic outline, just start writing. You won't get all the details by outlining. Just give yourself some direction and go scene by scene. Craft the dialogue and setting as you go. Then go back the next day, read it over, and see how well it flows. It's a constant cycle of writing and then rewriting before you even touch anything you feel is good, and then have someone else read it to let you know your ideas can be communicated to others. I do not agree with a lot of this. I genuinely, I agree with the basic point of like, yeah, you have to craft a story. That makes a lot of sense. But this approach to writing, honestly, is exactly the trap that I think the poster is already in. I think what they're saying here is kind of just what they're already doing, which is they're trying to outline, they're trying to write these characters, but this is a little basic. This is a little bit like what you do at the very beginning. And it sounds to me like the poster is ready for the next step of like, okay, how do I actually do this? Right. Then, there's some stuff here of like, starting with the characters. Yeah. Start with the character, right? Like I said before, how many characters and all of that. But again, I think the better approach is trying to do a lot more of this stuff in tandem than just starting with like who the character is. Well, you also want to come up with a good setting as you come up with the character too. And in terms of I think the idea and the hooks, and like I was saying before, the gut emotional appeal, because if you don't do a lot of that stuff before you get to the major dramatic question, you're probably just going to end up flopping around and guessing at what that dramatic question is. And a lot of that stuff you want to kind of bake into the pitch. So it's not that this is like bad advice. I think this isn't the best kind of advice for where this poster is at the moment. But obviously, I think that, it's reading between the lines. If they have really done a lot of research already and they know a lot of this stuff already, I just really suspect they've already gone down this path. And I think the whole thing around like the constant writing and rewriting, I used to think that was the way to do it. That was the way that I wrote my books. I would just start and I would write it, be like, oh, does that work? No, maybe not. Let me rewrite it. You're spending a lot of time writing something that just isn't working and you're wasting a lot of time. And what ends up happening is you end up going back and you feel like, I don't want to delete this. There's a lot of good stuff in this. And if you keep putting yourself in that position, you're going to burn out. You're going to get to the point where you're like, I'm tired of deleting everything that I'm writing and it's still not good enough. Right. And for me, like, I don't want to share a lot of my writing until I'm pretty far along. I don't want to share 3 chapters and I only have 3 chapters in the tank with somebody. I want to share something with that person that's way more polished. And I do not like, going about this as like writing 5 chapters, rewriting them, sending them to someone, rewriting them again. No. The reason you're rewriting it is because you are skipping too far ahead. You still have some basic stuff you need to figure out first, because if you do this correctly, where you can find yourself is that you are just flowing these words out, right? I knew that I was onto something when I was doing this approach and this kind of method, when all of a sudden I was writing like 4 or 5 chapters a week and not feeling like I had to rewrite them. I would go back and edit them. I would mess with them. And I would go back to them later on and, find little details that I could tweak. But I was not rewriting them. I was not totally changing of like, oh, I feel like this entire arc of the book needs to be taken out. That stopped happening. And I started actually writing books that people were like, this was really good, So speaking from experience, please learn from my mistakes. This is not the way to do it, in my opinion. Nick Spoon did respond to this, so I'm kind of curious. I want to read what they had to say to this. They said, excellent point, thank you. I think intentionality is a very important and perhaps under-discussed part of writing. Looking at my own process, it occurs to me that my intentions when writing a story are probably not as clearly defined as they should be. My gut feeling is that the intentions in my writing probably boil down to, I want to write a cool story about X, which is probably why so much of my writing is so vague and meandering. And yeah, that probably is the case. And yes, intentionality is good, but just keep in mind that you're not going to really get that intentionality from writing and rewriting over and over again. Intentionality is going to come from looking at your story a little bit more big picture and writing down some very specific points as to why you think this book should exist. And I think you're partly the way there. And I'm not saying that, that initial advice is totally off, but I do think that it's missing a lot. And I think that I just really don't want this poster to go down this road because I just feel like they're going to hit another dead end, just in my opinion. But all right. So Bladesy FTW said, I feel the struggle. Personally, I try to ground myself in characters as much as possible. Perhaps I have an idea for a general story or an ending or some cool world, but story comes from the character. I heard some good advice a while ago. Ask yourself these questions. What does my character want? Why doesn't that work? What do they do about it? Why doesn't that work? Etc. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of 101. I've kind of written stories this way as well. But here's the problem. If you're starting with what does my character want? Well, that's not the best place to start because I don't know. I don't think this poster knows. That's the problem. I think that they know this stuff. They've probably read a bunch of things and they've listened to podcasts saying like, that's where you start. But honestly, like this is more of an exercise to go through once you kind of go through a little bit of drafting and you have outlined a bit. And like I said before, you get into the dramatic question. What does the character actually want? And then you get into like what's stopping them, which that's conflict, right? But if you start with that and you don't really consider a lot of these other details, again, you're just going to kind of hit a brick wall and you're going to start changing the answer to that question over and over again, because then you're going to write, let's say 12 chapters and you're going to be like, honestly, the motivation I initially set out with for this character, it made sense in the moment, but now I'm finding this character is totally different from what I expected. And now I want to change it. And that's why you end up rewriting. And that's why it ends up taking you 2 years to write a book. And then you put it out there and agents are like, oh, this isn't for me. I'll pass. It just isn't, I could honestly look at this of like, what does this writer want? Why doesn't that work? And I'm trying to help answer that question, I guess, in a little bit. I know I'm a little bit fiery on this, but honestly, it's a struggle. And then Nick Spoon responded, writing half-decent characters is something I struggle mightily with. Those are some wonderfully straightforward questions to ponder when considering characters. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's something to ponder, but yeah, I think that poster is looking for something maybe a little bit more tangible, a little bit more like, okay, but I feel like that's not really what they're struggling with overall. I think that what they need is just, a little bit more nuance, right? All right, let's look at one more comment here. Okay, so this is from the Big Bad Wolf 22. I'm a pantser myself, and what that means is a lot of times there are stories that don't go anywhere. I abandoned one draft after 30,000 words, another after I had written 65,000. I tried writing the ending for one story first and then the beginning, but couldn't write the middle. It doesn't matter. The more you continue putting words down, the more you are training your mind toward the final novel. Just think of it as one more step in the process of eventually getting a published novel out. No. I'm so sorry, but no. If you are writing 65,000 words and you're coming out of it being like, at least I wrote it, that is not the right way to look at this. Look, it's not a net terrible, but again, this is what leads to burnout. Because if you keep making the same mistakes over and over again, you're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And that's not to say, look, I've written novels that went nowhere and kind of just crapped out, but you don't have to do that. This is not the only path. I think what ends up happening is that there are people who it takes them years and years to get to this point, and they spend all this time and put all these resources in. They write all these books to finally get to the one book that works. And then they say to other people, that's what I did, so that's what you should do. But no, you should not do that. You should not have to go down that road. It's not necessary, because if you are just pants writing, discovery writing, and you're ending up with all this work done and nothing to show for it, isn't that frustrating? Of course it's frustrating. You don't want to have to do that. There's a better way. And the better way is to, like I was saying before, start with this approach of big picture. What is my book really about? Try to flesh it out. And you know what honestly happens? Every time I come up with an idea, I have a whole journal. I have lots of story ideas that kind of come to me randomly. I'll be walking along and be like, a story about this would be interesting. And then if it sticks in my mind, I'm like, you know what? I can't get this idea out of my mind. I refer back to it, and then I'll go to my journal again, and then I'll sit down and I will go through the process, the book development process, and be like, all right, what kind of book would this be? Who would cater to it? And I would put myself through the ringer. I'd write the pitch. I do all this stuff. And here's what ends up happening. Let's say I come up with 5 solid story ideas a year. One of them I'm going to get through this process with and actually devote time to. Think of it this way. Have you ever been working on a book and you felt like, I kind of want to stop writing this book because I just came up with a better idea? The way to avoid that is to put yourself through the development process with every idea. Don't just totally commit and get caught up in the excitement before you actually put this idea through a test. And honestly, what I've ended up doing with a bunch of books over the years is I've looked back and I've gone back to something where I've been like, you know what, this wasn't working for me when I originally put it through the test, and I couldn't think of a good, dramatic question, or the pitch just wasn't quite, once I really put some thought into like the actual outline of this, I was like, yeah, it's not quite there, maybe someday. But then I've gone back and been like, hey, I just came up with a really good way to solve this later, years later. And then I was like, you know what, I'm ready to write this book now. And now this is going to work. And then I go through the process again. That's all to say. Please don't write 65 to 100,000 words before you feel like a story idea with the plot and everything is ready. You're just wasting time. And I wish I could take back the time that I wasted. And I just really don't like that advice. So this is definitely a more contentious one than the last episode, where I feel like a lot of the advice I was mostly agreeing with. But this one, I think that I feel like I'm evangelizing a little bit. I'm preaching. And so I do want to caveat all of this, of course, with this is my experience. My advice isn't going to apply to everybody's situation. And I think that there are multiple ways to go about this sort of thing. I'm just trying to share the one that really has worked way better for me and for other people that I've come across and I've tried to help out. And I stand by it. And I really believe that if you are struggling a lot, I think it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. What I want for writers is I want them to have to kill their darlings less if they can. I really hate doing it. I really hate having to go back and delete things that I think really work. And I found that as I've gotten much better at this outlining process I've been talking about, I've had to do that way less. And I've been able to like keep the stuff that really works because the story is so figured out. Maybe I do change something, but a lot of the material still functions and I can still keep it to some extent. So this is a long one, but hopefully that's going to be helpful for some people. And I really appreciate all the advice that this poster is getting. I think people's hearts are definitely in the right place. And even though I disagree, I do think that there's a lot to glean from here. And I'm curious about some of the other comments too, but I'm way over time. So this has been Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Thank you to my producer, Natalia Emmons, for helping me with that prompt. Thank you to my other producer, Bridgets Feedback, for helping me with clarifications and fact checks. And I'll see you all on the next one. All right, I'm back, and our producer, Bridgets Feedback, has reviewed my advice and is going to let me know if there are any fact checks necessary or any clarifications I can add that I might not have thought of. So I'm looking through Bridget's written feedback now, and we don't have any fact checks, but Bridget definitely had a lot to say. I love it. So Bridget said, I finished the new episode. Honestly, I kind of like the change between the first one, how you were largely in agreement, and in the second one, you largely weren't. Yeah, this was a big change from episode 1, where I think it just happened to be that I agreed with the feedback. And I always want to be honest about this stuff. I don't want to agree for the sake of it or disagree for the sake of it. I just want to be honest. And sometimes I've literally had the thought too, like while I'm reading these and recording, where I'm like, do I really disagree with this though? And I want to make sure, right? And I want to leave room for nuance, right? Okay, so then Bridget also said, this time around, I did not disagree with you at all. I wholeheartedly agree. I think some of the stuff the commenters had to say were valuable in a sense, but not for this OP, or at the very least, not the way they said it. Even the guy who writes 65,000 words and abandons it, there is a nugget of truth in there that any time spent writing is ultimately helpful. Practice always makes better. It doesn't make perfect. But writing 65,000 and abandoning it won't make you better. It'll lead to burnout. Yeah, Bridget, it's tough. I see this advice go around so often, and it frustrates me. That's why I got a little bit fiery. Bridget also commented on that. And yeah, I think the big thing for me is that people think it's great advice. And look, that's not to say that it's not good advice for someone. I'm sure there are some people who want to do that, but I think most people just burn out. And the reason I know that is because I see it over and over again. And yeah, work smarter, not harder. Well, actually, no, I shouldn't. Work smarter, not more. There's another way to say, because you are working hard. That's all I'm trying to say. But yeah, and it's tough because sometimes when I've disagreed with people about this, they've said, well, you have to write. Like you just write, write. And I'm like, yeah, right. But don't write aimlessly, just writing for the sake of it isn't going to do nearly as much to help you in the long run. Writing effectively includes a lot of things. And writing a great novel that's 100,000 words, maybe it won't get published. Maybe, it's still not going to be quite up to snuff, but it's better than writing a 100,000 word bad novel and feeling like, I spent all that time and it just didn't go anywhere. And so that's the thing that you want to avoid. That's all. Okay, so then Bridget also said, also, personally, when I'm in the development stage, I do a fair amount of discovery writing to figure out the characters a bit more, specifically in how they speak and how I want to have the narrator sound. But I try not to write actual plot points. I try to put the characters in backstory stuff or AUs or whatever, just to see what they're like. And then, once I think I have a voice I like, I'll go back and start outlining pretty similarly to how you described it. But take that with a grain of salt. Yeah, one thing I haven't mentioned about Bridget, and I don't know if they're going to be okay with me mentioning this, but Bridget happens to be a dungeon master. So Bridget has a lot of D&D experience and knows a lot about character and is also a great illustrator. So that's sort of their background. But yeah, I love this. I think that discovery writing your lore is always a good idea. In fact, I've been anticipating that Natalia might send me a prompt related to this kind of thing. So I'll hold back a little bit on that, but there are so many fun things you can do with discovery writing that, like Bridget is saying, that don't have to be the actual novel, but can be, for example, a scene in your novel. So maybe part of the idea you have for a novel might be a pivotal confrontation between two characters, maybe at the midpoint of the novel. Write that scene, right? It's not going to be the final thing, obviously, but it just might be a good exercise in how would these two characters interact. I like to do this even without writing it down. I like to daydream a lot, and a lot of the concepting I do happens to be when I'm driving, when I take a shower, anything where I'm unplugged a little bit more than usual, and I can just sort of let the story happen in my mind. And that's honestly one of the first things that made me realize I want to be a writer, is because I just daydream so much. As a kid, I did it all the time. I would literally just be in my own thoughts. Of course, this is the age before iPads, so it was a little bit easier, or I guess more necessary back then. But anyway, that's just one way to go about it. Hopefully we'll do a full-on episode where we can talk more about that kind of practice and the different concrete things you can do to make that work. So yeah, that was about everything that Bridget had to say, although Bridget did also have this. They said, a cool idea does not make a good story. I'll take a decently executed, cliched story over a poorly executed, cool idea any day. That's tough to hear, but yeah, Bridget, I think I agree. It's tough because I do like it when people kind of do a big swing and a miss, but if I'm being honest with myself, not really, right? I was just recording my review of Joker Folie à Deux, and that is such a good example of cool idea, poorly executed. And you know what? I love to be basic with movies. Sometimes I just want that cookie cutter, Hallmark, rom-com. I just get so much enjoyment out of cliched stories sometimes. And I know in the first episode, I was like, how to avoid cliches. But to be honest, sometimes a cliche is a cliche for a reason, and I don't mind it in every single circumstance. But anyway, yeah, I'm there. I think a cool idea is great, but you need something else. And Bridget also shared something really cool that I want to share with you all as well. They mentioned how when it comes to your story and putting these things together, they mentioned how the commenters all kind of seem to all gravitate toward start with the character. What does the character want and all that stuff? But Bridget rightfully, in my opinion, pointed out that characters are only a piece of it. And there's this Tumblr post they shared with me that gets into how you can't really have the characters without the world and the plot. So I kind of touched on that a little bit in terms of like these things kind of need to be drafted in parallel. And I think that that's just such a thing, right? Because the diagram itself, it's like a triangle and you have characters at the top, you have the plot in the bottom left and the world in the bottom right. And the way to explain this, I asked Bridget to explain it because I don't want to butcher this. I literally said explain like I'm 5. And Bridget said, okay, so basically this little diagram thing is a way to think about plot setting and characters. The characters are cool and you can focus in on that if you want, but they will feel out of place or without some sort of motivation if you don't also consider the plot and the world as you're making it. And so I think the commenters were kind of getting to that because when you're talking about what does the character want, that is where you're getting into the plot. But sometimes people will do that independent of the world when those things do kind of tie into it. And Bridget even says this going on. They say the world creates the characters carry the plot, and the plot depends on the world. While simultaneously, the world is changed by the plot. The plot is moved / pushed by the characters, and the characters are limited by the world, which I'm sure you know. And yeah, it's so cool. And it's such a healthy way to look at this sort of thing because it's like I was saying in the first episode, trying to come up with everything before you do one thing is not a great idea. I think that you have to really be thinking about different facets all the time, playing these scenarios out. And if you're coming up with like a character arc, you got to have the world in mind. And sometimes you're just going to have a day devoted to the world, right? Maybe you're just like, you know what? I'm going to devote this writing session to just figuring out this world a little bit more. I'm not going to think about the character today. I'm going to think about the character tomorrow. That sort of thing. And yeah, it's a process. I think sometimes people think that the writing process is like, I just sit down and all this stuff is just going to come to me because they listened to that one George R.R. Martin interview where he said that. And look, you're not George R.R. Martin, and amazing stories aren't just going to fall into your lap. Maybe someday they will. Maybe they are, and I'm just ignorant of that. But for the most part, most of you, it's just not going to happen automatically. There are some very specific steps you can take to set yourself up for success in that regard. So there you go. Thank you very much, Bridget, for the helpful clarifications and additions to that. And I was very nervous sending this to Bridget because I was like, oh man, am I going to come off as a total jerk face? But Bridget did confirm that at least to them, I did not come off as a total jerk face. Maybe only a little bit of a jerk face, but hey, that's okay. I think Bridget's exact words were passionate, so that's good. All right, thanks for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Have a good rest of your day, and definitely keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.